Okay, so without further ado, pleased to welcome Stacy up here to give her talk. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I do feel like I should either offer coffee, chocolate chip cookies, or a stretch. It's over here. I'm really delighted to be steeping in this kind of octopus-like many-armed world of maps and visual information. So many people are from different necks of disciplines. Is that okay? Talk more closer. Get closer to me. Okay. Um, and I wanted to thank everyone who's made this all happen, particularly to Stace Maples, who we share a first name, and has invited me to this, and it's been great, and to all the people who made it happen and make the whole thing happen. David, the David Rumsey collection has been a nearly mythic site for me. When I first discovered that I could find old maps online versus trying to dredge them out of various stores and then to overlay things was a real game changer for me. And it's been wonderful to find out about the historic waterways of Philadelphia and New York, and been quite essential to my work. So it's kind of amazing to end up here. I actually thought of it like a kind of temple on a hill somewhere, but not up a turret. And you will note too that I say water kind of funny because I'm from Philadelphia. So Susan spoke about how Richard Eads Harrison's was making maps with an artist's eye and, if not an artist's soul. And I feel that the artist's desire to express the world makes artists an extremely natural fit, if not an unorthodox fit, to be the cartographers of everyday life. I myself am an eco-revelatory artist. That's a relatively new name. I work to reveal the ecology of the site, and my deep interest is in the local waterways and how we bring them into our minds and hopefully into our hearts. So when you think about water on the map, it's just a bunch of thin blue threads, curving lines, sometimes meandering if you're lucky, but not a whole lot more than that. And really very few people give a damn about any of these creeks. They're running under places as nobody wanted them. You build a parking lot, the last thing you want is a creek running through it. All sorts of the structures that we have that we've given the poorest land to are in the wettest areas, which is sort of interesting. But behind that blue line on the map, the reality is a small stream running through our landscapes, running through our backyards, often running through our cities, but bringing the water from the rain down to the ocean. And even though they're degraded and tiny, they're very, very important. They're often scoured by stormwater. They're often culverted, put into pipes, and many are very, very hard to find. It's one of the invisible features of the landscape is the water running through it. And often they smell pretty bad too because they're, especially in older cities, are combined sewer outfalls. But when you really see them, when you see them flowing and you get to know their connectivity, these waterways should become part of our sense of place. So my work is a lot about trying to make streams have meaning to people by mapping them for the most part and trying to create an understanding of where we are in the watershed so that people can learn their watershed address and get a sense of how they're connected overall. And I certainly do love a great watershed map. I spend a lot of time looking at 2D maps, but I believe that there's another kind of mapping that has yet to be expanded on, a kind of experiential map that we've actually seen some wonderful versions of that, where you can really get into the place of the map and experience it in a more kinetic, bodily way. And you can see those connections between streams that when they're the blue threads, you may sort of forget, but you really sense them when you see them. So one of the things I've been doing is making a collected watershed map. And we begin by gathering water samples from every tributary that is being pictured in this map. The first step is back to paper. I go look at the two-dimensional map to figure out where I need to take the vehicles that are filled with the buckets and lids, very important part, that we take to the sites. And then we have to find our way down into the streams, which is surprisingly difficult in a lot of areas, very brambly or often impossible to get to with private lands. And then get the buckets down there and then haul the buckets back up. And water is very heavy at 8 pounds a gallon. And then everything has to be labeled quite carefully, because if you lose the labels, it's like having your wine collection be flooded and all the labels fall off and you really don't know what you have. So the provenance is very important to me. Some places, some streams are smelly enough that I can identify them from far away. So, and then they're stored into a water pantry, with hopefully something with a moppable floor. Meanwhile, often in the evening, I'm laying the map out on the floor of the gallery. This is the Towson Art Center near Baltimore. And then laying down with vinyl or some kind of method the names of waterways and the place names too, so that people can sort of tell where they are within the map. And then there's the very careful, and I'm particularly bad at this part, so I rarely do it, filling of the containers themselves. And I always have a problem convincing curators that they want to do a project like this, because wetness and art don't always go together, and I add a lot of humidity to the museum too. But we switch the systems and it usually works out. So the map's complete when the water's collected, jars are on the floor, containers are filled, labels are on. And then people can walk through these spaces, these maps that are are very careful and relatively to scale, though my glass lines are a little bigger than the blue threads on the map, but it's as to scale as possible to so people can see what the watershed is made of, basically. And each waterway in the map holds the actual water from that tributary that we have collected. And water quality becomes extremely apparent. It's very interesting. You get some streams that are fairly clear. Not that clear means healthy, but in the old tale that streams with poor water quality are usually found in the less affluent neighborhoods. And this kind of ground truthing of what our water is in all these places in different neighborhoods is not apparent on an average map. Everything's a blue line on a map. It doesn't tell you the water quality, and it doesn't give you a sense of it just simply by smelling it or seeing the different colors. So that's a very important thing. This idea that people are going to go out and preview the map and experience the map before it's built, and then sometimes afterwards when we have to recollect water because it's evaporated. So I think it's really important for people to get out into the field and see and touch the water and see the degraded banks and how so many of the streams are in culverts, and how a parking lot might push the channel of a stream into a little pinched area. So witnessing how we treat our waters is a very important part of these maps. And we become water detectives when you're searching for water in an average neighborhood. You're looking for certain things, ways to locate streams. A bridge is a pretty nice, obvious one, but they're not always there. But you're often searching for bands of taller vegetation or more tangled vegetation, because those trees and shrubs are growing on a bank that could not be cut down because no one wanted to develop it because it was either too floody or too steep. And then the black and yellow striped signs that for years I had no idea what those were talking about, but now I look for them all the time, telling you that water, this is in the US, is running under this piece of the road. So we're sending out, it's usually students I'm working with, sometimes community members who are volunteering to do this. They're all becoming cartographic data collectors themselves. They're scoping out the sites and collecting the water. And a lot of counter data is being produced too. People who, it looks on the map that there's no stream that's running under this part of Baltimore, but it turns out there is water running under there. It's just culverted. And if you find where it comes out, you're able to collect it. So this firsthand experience of the actual thing, of the thing that's being mapped, is really critical in the water maps, to witness this reality. Because that kind of understanding of a site is so important. And not only is there understanding, but there also can be wonder. I really want people to see their watersheds in a different light than how you see them when you hold a map up or you look at your Google Maps. And the various maps that we see on the computer screen how do you get to feel those actual places and see the actual water and kind of get into a meander and how it gets made differently than a line? And it gives people a chance to reflect on the small waterways that they might have seen in their backyard that they didn't really think that much about, and then to see that connection to the next stream and the next stream and finally to a larger river and then out into the ocean. It connects your backyard to the whole watershed. And I notice too, when people are walking over these maps, they're often walking in the narrowest areas that are oftentimes where the actual bridges of roads are. So it's a different way of experiencing a river. And then sometimes you get to trace it on these more permanent maps that I do also. You get to trace the flow of water in the map. Or you can feel the long downward slope when you're painting the historic waterway onto a city street. You can feel that slope of where the water used to go. I've been doing a lot of temporary maps that are made with lots and lots of people going out and painting the historic creeks or marshes of parts of New York City and Queens and Brooklyn with a chalk paint, a slurry that washes away nicely, poetically in the next rain. And this mapping reveals something that wasn't so present in people's minds a few years ago when I started. I wasn't really thinking about it this way. I thought, oh, it's very interesting to know where the water did run. But it's actually revealing where the water is now running when there's a flood. The original patterns of these watersheds are emerging when it rains hard. And these creeks and waterways that we've put underground and put into pipes are coming back to haunt us in a new way, a kind of a wet ghost coming into the city that had been there, that had flowed once in the city, but no longer does except through pipes. And often these historic creeks are present in other guises. You see them in sunny day puddles. This puddle had been dry for 2 weeks and there was still a puddle. And when we were painting this, all the doormen talked about, well, they were very skeptical of all the blue paint on people's feet at first, but then they started talking about how they ran pumps in their basement 24 hours a day because there was so much water in the basement, and they'd never had that in the building that was a couple blocks away. And people would tell us, oh yeah, this area is called the mosquito block because there were so many mosquitoes, probably because of the sunny day puddle. So these full-scale maps of a site, of a moment, in sort of historical time, telling you where the water was, also is telling you where the water is going to be. I've always been very intrigued by rain and where it goes when it comes out of the sky. And I wanted to bring that sense of rain into the watershed. So it wasn't just the watershed that seems to be flowing all the time, but you can make that connection of what feeds the watershed. And to start to forge a visual sense of the falling rain and the watershed. The first project or second project that I was able to do, where I was able to take the water from the roof, working with the landscape architects and the architects of the site, of the Penn State Arboretum, was to have it all come off the roof and pour into the map that I had created. And it creates a very kinetic watershed experience, particularly when it's raining, and it makes an actual watershed in miniature. So you can find where you are and you can watch it flow through. There's a lot of engineering to keep these tiles tipping the right way so they flow correctly. I'm a huge fan of Edward Tufte, my first step into visual information. And this idea about envisioning information is very important to me as an ecological artist, because I really want to show what changes happen to a natural thing such as a stream, what happens when it's regular or low flow, what happens when it rains really hard, and making kind of visual diagrams that you can see, that you can tell what's going on with the weather. And it either, in this case, it's either hanging down in a straight form when there's low water, the typical situation. It's in a U shape when there's fast water. This is a very blurry slide because it's taken in a big rainstorm. Or 2 or 3 days after the flooding of this creek, the water would slow down but still be very high, and the piece made an L shape. So it's the height of the river is depicted by the shape of these sort of beaded curtain, they're all buoys. And seen from the street, you can get an everyday read of where the water level is, something you might have ignored just walking down the street before. I wanted to give a sense of the urban tides. And in this case, this is on the East River in Williamsburg, a 4-foot tide that most people don't know about. I grew up next to the Schuylkill with a 6-foot tide, no idea that there was a tide in that river until I was about 20. And I thought, what a shame. But this is the typical way that we know tides, is through these, rather, there's a lovely tide chart, but who has a, I mean, I have 4 tide charts on my phone, but most people don't walk around with a lot of tide charts on their phones. So how do you make something so that people can see this phenomenon without having to have the equipment to see it? They can kind of fall into the information. So this is the Tide Flowers project. And I was sort of cracking up about Harrison's, the twirling skirt, because this has a twirling skirt attitude also, but used slightly differently. So at high tide, the skirt twirls out, and at low tide, the tidal flower closes down by closing its blossom. These projects are an active collaboration with nature. I have to work with what nature is going to do to the art. And they show the changing levels by floating on top of the surface. And they're responding directly to the surface of the water. Once they're in, I don't really have a lot of control over what's happening. But in this case, nature is altering the art so that people can see what's happening in nature. That changing form is the descriptor of what's going on, the registration. And that kind of legibility seems very, very important, that we get to understand what's going on in nature, not through a textbook in a classroom, but by walking next to it, walking past it. The idea that people can get their tide, can understand it, is really important to me, that they can understand a completely different timekeeper in their city. And it gives you a sense of connection. And I do think that connection is what both maps and art can give to people, this connection to your world, because we're unfortunately extremely removed from what's going on just next to our sidewalks, or even on our sidewalks. We have no sense of how you can walk down the street and the wind is blowing all sorts of interesting pieces of nature in, and you have no idea what's being brought by. So making this connection, giving people a connection in natural patterns, seems to be extremely important role for art right now, because being lost in your own world seems really sad. It's like cooking in someone else's kitchen. You don't know where anything is, and it's not the same. I want people to have a stronger relationship and a foothold to some aspect of the natural world, and a sense of the other things that are living there too. I'm straying a bit from maps, but going into showing by this sort of depiction of something you couldn't see before. These are this project talks about the diatoms that are living in the East River, the tiny microalgae, and we can't see them, but they're present, absolutely important for creating oxygen. 50%, they say, up 40 to 50% of our oxygen is created by diatoms throughout the world. And the patterns are extraordinary and beautiful. And to know that they're out there in the river gives you a sense of being at home in your world, which I think is really important to create that connection. I wish these patterns that we share with the natural world were more commonplace and more known, like the dendritic pattern of branches. The same pattern that's in our bodies, running the blood through our bodies, is the same that's running the water through the great organ of the land. And so how do you get people to know these connections and to feel those connections? So mapping is my start to navigate the connection and creating a way to introduce people, students and volunteers alike, to where their local waterways are and what they feel like when you get into them. And giving the invisible things what Tufte called the bright legibility, so that they can be known and they can be felt to be part of us and that we're part of them. Thank you. Right on time.
Okay, thank you so much, Stacy. That was remarkable. Now we have a bit of time. Am I correct? We have about 15 minutes for some questions and answers. And so I'd like to ask the speakers, please, from our panel, Jan, Alameda, and Stacy, come back up here. Yep. All right. You've got chairs. Excellent. So let's get some questions going and keep them brief and to the point, and we'll get as many of them in as we can. Okay. Yep.
So inspiring. Thank you all so much. It seemed that all three of you, by uncovering the water, you were uncovering community. And I thought you could all three speak to the significance and the importance of reclaiming lost stories through water.
Yeah, I think actually I was just telling someone this panel was remarkably well constructed, I think, in terms of order and content and everything. For me, it was really going back to Lagos. And so as someone who's trained as a historian, leaving the archive is kind of frightening. It's scary. It's just better to be doing research on your own in a way. So, but going into Lagos Island and walking in those areas and actually trying to connect with people and the work became important. And then I started realizing I was actually walking on these stories. There are many, many parts and intersections in the city where water tells particularly interesting stories, but because it's very low-lying and swampy, and it attracts mosquitoes, there are all these, quote, slum clearance campaigns that have stripped Lagos of these water features that people used not just for sustenance and fishing and living, they actually worshipped particular, deities or other things there. So there's actually a real culture and history of community and coming together that's completely gone. And part of what I'm thinking about is how, as you had in your presentation, how can we mark this space so that people who live there know that there's a real significance to where they are, where they're walking. And one of the things, I don't think I mentioned this, but in Lagos, in Lagos Island, when you're walking, the road seems to always curve and bend in strange ways. No, it's following the waterways. And when it floods as well, people are always surprised to see this flooding, but if you knew this layered history, it's all really predictable and actually getting worse.
And I think it's a very interesting thing to see how the modern human dreads wetness. Like we do not like soggy and we do not like scruffy. But those are the places where everything happens. That's where life happens. In the soggy, in the scruffy. You pave it over, you dry it out, you get nothing but a monoculture. So in a certain way, you would expect all the stories to die with that too. The environmental story dies and the cultural stories die also. And it's an interesting thing that somehow we're going to have to bring ourselves back to living with the soggy and the scruffy.
That's, I think, exactly also my point. In the Netherlands, especially, and the area that I'm talking about it's called Zeeland, so sea land. And in their personal history of the Netherlands, and specifically this province, water has always played an important role in the sense of, in the Netherlands, they really proud of that they conquered water. They're the Low Countries. They have been embanking so much, and now that's they have a lot of land lying actually under the water line, but it's very vulnerable. And one of the things that really has to change in the next decades is to re-accept that water plays a bigger role in the landscape. They will have to, this is happening in 2019, the first part of an embankment was given back to the sea. So this is, from a historical point of view, we started embanking in around the year 1000. So we're now with the first steps giving back water to the sea, and this is of course what will happen in the next decades, centuries, even more. And yeah, maps like that one provide a really good time depth, and people often think in generations if they don't have historical time depth, that's they're not trained as an historian. Most people just think in generations, and I think it's important that we provide in this case also time depth, so they can see, okay, this landscape changed the last 2000 years so much, whereas they now see it as a static thing, but that's not the case. So that's also important.
Okay, thank you. Back over by the pillar there. Yes, sir. In the maroon. Yeah, yes.
I'm from Williamsburg. And when I saw my river, I didn't know there was that much history in my river. And then when I heard your story, I said, she read the river. Okay, she read, you both, you all of you read the river. And what came out for me was the anthropological layer that you spoke about when you went use LIDAR to go different layers into the soil to find the same hillock that you talked about in the beginning, and that those hillocks and the ceramic, you know, the anthropological story of the ceramic, you traced it back to milk production. Okay, I'm speechless. Okay, I'm just speechless. I never know. And by the way, where I live, Creekside in Salinas, I'm gonna go back and take a look at that creek. Okay, I'm gonna go back and take a look at that creek. And when you use chalk to track the river, I'm gonna do something about that. Okay, like I'm gonna track my river. I want to see like when it runs through my city, where it ends up and how it ends up there. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful observation about the way that all of these presentations really encourage us to think about doing something, like actually, we want to go and look at these creeks, and maybe, when we see an old map, I'd never thought of this before. I was always kind of like, oh, that's a nice old map, but you could actually try to use it like it is a map, and it shows you kind of where things were. And Ademide's combination of the embodied individual and their story in these kind of what otherwise would seem like, it's a map for a bombardment. It's not a very promising place to start, and yet it's actually like the grounds to rediscover a place that was otherwise hidden. So wonderful observations. I think we have time for a couple more. So right up here in front, sir in the striped shirt, or maybe checked.
It's checked.
Oh, it's like you're on
LLB's
It's
best.
like you're on TV. It's all.
So I had a thought at the end of Stacy's wonderful presentation, which may warrant comments from all the panelists. Put my geography hat on, and any geographer will tell you the river flow, stream flow is just part of the hydraulic regime. You call the ground flow. So how might one study wells and the points of access to groundwater, and what might that do to the larger projects that you're engaged in?
That's a good one. One of the things that I notice when I'm making these artworks, and they are, I guess, artworks first and maps second, is that it's very hard to layer information in stone. I'm actually working on this project out in Alameda Creek, and I'm trying to layer the historical map, which is filled with all sorts of wonderful meandering tidal creeks, and now it's all been straightened out into these salt basins. And I thought, oh yeah, I'll talk about all this stuff. But my medium of either one color against asphalt or one blasted line makes it really difficult. And I need to work out a way to have more layered information. One of the maps that were shown where there were two colors, and the map maker made 6 colors by the different hatching, thick hatching, thin hatching, solid color. I thought, oh, if I could just get that technique down in a sculptural way. But it is hard. It's hard to do the layers, but I think it's really important.
Thank you. That's actually a really great question in my context. I have a map from something like 1891 with all the wells in Lagos. And I've always wondered what I can do with this map, and but I actually never thought of them as a sort of network in a way. And it's interesting, some of the wells cluster around a street, around an old lagoon that used to be there. And the street is called Omididun, which in English is sweet water, almost like fresh water. So I've always wondered that there's all these layers of knowledge that is there. And but there's no documentation about this. We just have these spatial representations. So you've given me one more project to do in terms of thinking about these wells, because they don't exist anymore, but they have been mapped from about 75 or more years ago.
Well, in this case, we're in the coastal plain, so there's the only wells are actually in the they're like bubbles in the dunes, most of it. But I want to follow up on that one. The interesting thing is that what we discovered also in this research is that the region is called Zwin region, and the toponymic, the place name Zwin, as was actually never well studied, and we went into that, and the Germanic base word appears to be Schwin, and which relates to today's verschwunden, disappearing. And so what's the case here? Zwin. This is not the only Zwin toponym. It's actually all over Europe. You have Swinemunde, which is now Polish. You have it Twinsburg. You have it all over coastal places. And the hypothesis that we have now, that might also be interesting for you, is that the indication of this word gives the topographic location where sweet water, or is it sweet water? Yeah, sweet water becomes too saline, but it's salinated. So the difference between sweet and salt, which is from a landscape point of view, a very important, if you live in this landscape and we're now talking about early medieval period, maybe Roman period even, they're not always living there with the villages. There's more like sheep farmers going on in the landscape. Then it's very important that you know where the sweet water is and where the salt water is, where you can drink and where not. So that's the Swin toponyms. That's also something I have to get in to. Actually, all over the coast in northwestern Europe and in Flanders, there's a lot of them, and they probably indicate where this sweet water disappears.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, I think. Someone will wave at me when we run out of time. Yes.
These projects were amazing, like everybody said. It really makes me wish I was doing such cool things. But one thing that I was curious to hear you say, all of your projects are kind of in conversation with people outside of the academy, right? Present day interlocutors. So I was curious if you have some examples of how conversations you've had with the people in these places has come back and shaped what you've done, right? So determining insights not just from the archival record, from historic material, from kind of professional training as academics or artists, but what are some cases where somebody said something to you that's kind of open up an insight or something that you didn't know before?
Yes, the living room lectures, for example, were very interesting because as I said, you're very close to your audience, and then the audience is much more active. There's no boundary what you have in normal lectures, and the idea is also that they could participate. They could also choose. I didn't say it. They could choose certain topics we were talking about, and there were indeed occasions where we were in a living room, so most of the time was just projected on the TV, that people came out of their sofas and then went to the screen. No, I live here. And then the host itself, for example, was totally convinced that his house was on the 16th century map, but it was not the case. I checked it beforehand. And then his neighbor's house was on the map, and there was really nearly a neighbor fight between those two, because the one was like, "Oh, my house is on the map," and the other one was, "No." The living room lectures is one, and then two is the advantage, or one of the good things of driving on your bike through this landscape. So I had an average of 16 kilometers per hour, which is not that much, because you're often navigating yourself and then finding sites. And then when you're there with your bike, looking at the landscape, you have a lot of maps in front of your bike. Then people stop and they start talking. And then they say, and it happened a lot. Then I say, yes, I'm looking for this house on the map. And then what's this kind of map? And then you start a lot of talking. But they also, like, okay, I asked, why is this grass field so bumpy? Then they start telling all kinds of stories. Oh, my grandfather, he found some brick there, so there must have been a building. And You of course also get the urban legends quite a lot, but that's very interesting. The interaction is very, very helpful indeed.
I think one of the best things that someone ever said is, I'll never look at the landscape the same way. And they started going, like, whenever there was a little moisture and you'd get that early green grass line on a forested slope, it's like one person out there got it. So I'm pretty thrilled with that. But one of the things I've also learned when I was working on the Schuylkill, which you said perfectly, and talking to the neighbors who were passing through, and I noticed that I come to that river thinking, I love being near the water. And a lot of the neighbors come to the river saying, this is a dangerous place. I don't want my kids down here because they don't know how to swim or it's filled with terrible industrial debris. So that sort of switch off, like, I love every water, but I don't see its danger, was very enlightening to me. So the idea of making safe places near rivers, places where kids can be contained, look at the water, maybe not touch it, but get pretty close to it, has become a very informing and important part of my work.
Thank you. So this is a really interesting question. And I mean, like everyone else, I have different kinds of encounters, but one I'll say I think was striking for me, helped me to sort of resist pattern making in my own mind because I was looking for particular patterns. So when I first started walking in Lagos and comparing the actual city to the old maps, I would look for patterns all the time. And something that happened in Lagos frequently are these fires. The people basically incinerate almost entire neighborhoods. And so I was walking one day and found a street called Inobere. The fire started here. I was like, oh, interesting. And I started comparing it to the archival record. And within maybe 15 minutes of walking, I found another street, Inosa. The fire stopped. I was like, oh, I have an entire narrative made just for me right in this block, and I will write this story. But then I started talking to people, and they're like, no, this is not what happened. It was spelled wrong in your map. Your map is wrong. This doesn't work. Actually, Inobere is not what you think. It's somebody's name from Brazil. And so we'll have these debates. I was like, you're spoiling my story. I have a very cool article that's coming. And then in the end, because somebody told me this is actually my family house, Inosa is not the fire left, even though you want it to be, this is my family name. And I was really upset. And I found, I found a court case with the family name, and I'm still fighting it. so it's not always what you want, is when you talk to people.
All right, thank you. We have time for, I guess, a few more questions. We're still waiting for the catering, so that's the bad news. The good news is we have a bit more time. Okay, yeah, go ahead, please. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your presentations. There, as everyone has said, they're really incredible. And this, again, may be a question that applies to everyone, but it was at the end of Stacy's presentation, she mentioned her work was a collaboration with nature. It strikes me that it's also very much a collaboration with your audiences, with other artists, and I think in all of the projects that were talked about, collaboration sounds like it's a really important part of developing inventive solutions to problems. And I'm curious to, if you might say something about the way in which working with maybe other people who have certain kinds of knowledge or expertise helps shape the projects, and you develop something that maybe you on your own or they on their own would not have come up with.
Absolutely. And that's very near and dear to my heart, because when I was trained as an artist, it was the idea you'd go up into a garret and you would paint or sculpt by yourself and then bring it down and trade it for your lunch. And then you'd start again. And I thought that art was something one person made by themselves, which is very lonesome and kind of boring too. So I really needed to change that up a little bit, and working with people who are making the art with you is great, and it's not so hierarchical as like my assistants will take care of that now. But also, in terms of problem solving, we don't have enough hard drive on our own to solve problems anymore. You need to plug into other people's disciplines and hard drives. You need to gather them all together and work together, or you're not going to come up with any kind of meaningful answer if we can. So I think this idea of collaborating between disciplines is absolutely essential and should be the banner that we fly from here on in.
On an academic level, I'm of course in between many disciplines. I'm trained as an archaeologist. I do a lot of historical research, but I do this with historians, and then also landscape research. But I think for me, also the collaboration with, I call them artists, who made the AR and the VR. The French company Timescope did this. And I was really surprised at that moment how this collaboration worked. We were all kind of the same age people. Some of them were helped developing the special effects of Pirates of the Caribbean. But then they chose not to go into the gaming or in the film industry where big money was, but they were interested in heritage and they wanted to do something specifically, put their art into heritage. And yeah, that combination was really an eye opener for me. There, they put so much effort in it. They were really into the subject. Also, I didn't expect it that they would read so much. And we had every week for 1 year. We had very intense communications. And the end product, or when we were nearing towards the end product, then you also see that these drawings, the AR and the VR drawings that they make, they force you to go beyond to what you have been researching yet. For example, the VR boots are 360, so you're on the place, and then you can look around for 360. But my PhD research was on the village, which was like 180, and then they were saying like, okay, but we have to visualize the back also, and we were like, okay, but I didn't study this, and yeah, then we have to come up with another. We made just a kind of frame, but then they came all okay. But which trees are these? I don't have the data. Okay, you want dried fish? How are they packed? The dry fish, is it in tons or are they with ropes? And I was like, okay, all these data we didn't check, and then we had to check it, of course, very rapidly. But it's making these maps and 3D. Products is very beneficial for your research itself. You see where the black spots are in your research and where you need to put some more, or can put some more effort.
So I definitely agree with both of you in that sense. And as somebody who's an academic historian, there's definitely this tendency and this push to frame your work as it's entirely sole author. It's your work. Your first book is sole authored. Your work you're doing is all solitary and by yourself, and you're in the archive. But really, it actually is collaborative. Nothing I've done has only been because of my efforts, even if it's just support systems or mentors. But I think that while it's discouraged in my field to a certain extent to sort of collaborate, although I think that's changing definitely a lot, I find that, as you said, collaboration is really key to rethinking and having perspective. The place I work on, history is not something that's often studied. It's not really pushed in schools. They're always pulling it off, on and off the curriculum, even for secondary schools. So for me, it was really important to start to question, who am I doing this for and why? And why, in the early parts of my work, why do people who are living where I'm writing about, why don't they recognize or respond to my work when I show it to them? And so collaboration has really allowed me to sort of move away from only thinking about documents and, all the answers are in the archive. Actually, all the questions are in the real world. And we can find answers in all kinds of places. So for me as a historian, branching out from just being by myself and actually collaborating with people, even though it's safer to be by yourself in the garrets or surrounded by old material, it's ultimately more rewarding, I think, and more generative to collaborate with others, especially non-historians.
All right, do we have time for more? Okay, excellent.
Thanks again for the great presentations. I had more of a technical question. I wonder if you could elaborate on the process for like vectorizing the historic maps, and is that, georeferencing those and like following the lines, is that a tedious manual process, or is there good software for that?
Well, I would say on my end, I use so I used to use there are a variety of things you could use, and different libraries actually have different tools, and people have like Map Warper. I use ArcGIS mostly and ArcMap. And every map can't be georeferenced. Actually, these ones that I've put up on the wall can't be georeferenced because they're more sketches. So what I do is I georeference the ones that are actually more geographically accurate and draw more and then export that. So it is, yes, it's tedious. Yes, and then I export those images to other software, things like Adobe Illustrator or other things where I will add more vector material and other things like that. So, I mean, things have changed a lot from when I started. There's a lot more exciting and easier ways to do this now. And in fact, I met someone here who has a program, Felt, I think it is. It makes it so much easier now. So definitely look into newer tools. It's not as tedious as it used to be.
Same for me. I most of the time use ArcMap just for the georeferencing and the vectorizing also. And then, of course, when you make the applications, then there's some other IT guys coming in. That's not my business.
Okay, I think that is going to wrap things up. I don't know whether that means that the catering is actually here or not. We shall see. I do see one. Do we have time for one last question?
You mentioned resources. Just one to share is David James Duncan, The River Why, where he talks about the role of water in origin myths universally in so many cultures. And he talks about humans being a product of the sun and light energy and water. And he has this great quote where he says, humans and all life forms were created by water as containers to carry itself around in.